The small town was buzzing with excitement that evening. It wasn't every day that a famous pianist came to perform at the local community center. People had been talking about it for weeks. Some were curious, some were skeptical, but almost everyone wanted to see what kind of music a real professional would play. The concert hall was small, but it was filled with energy. Chairs were lined neatly, and a shiny grand piano stood on the stage, catching the soft lights that made it almost glow. There was a sense of expectation in the air, like something big was about to happen, even though no one knew exactly what it would be. Among the crowd, there was a woman who seemed completely out of place. She wore simple clothes, not flashy at all, and carried herself with quiet confidence. She wasn't there for fame or recognition. She didn't even plan to perform. She was just someone who loved music, someone who had grown up listening to it in the small moments of life, the lullabies her grandmother sang, the faint tunes from the radio in the mornings, the melodies she had imagined in her head while working long hours at her little cafe in town. Music had always been part of her, but she had never shown it to anyone outside her home. The famous pianist arrived in the hall with the kind of presence that made everyone notice him immediately. He was tall, dressed in a black suit that gleamed under the stage lights. There was a certain arrogance in the way he carried himself. He smiled at the audience, but it wasn't a warm smile. It was the kind of smile that suggested he already thought he was the best, that everyone in the room was lucky to watch him play. People whispered to each other, half in awe, half in nervousness. Some admired his skill from videos and past performances, but others could feel the tension in his aura. There was something in the way he looked at people, a subtle judgment, as if he had already decided who was worthy of his time and who wasn't. The woman watched quietly from the back. She didn't feel intimidated. She wasn't the type to be easily swayed by appearances or reputation. She had seen the world enough to know that talent didn't always come with a suit or a title. She only cared about the music. As the pianist made his way to the stage, adjusting the microphone and preparing the piano, she felt a familiar flutter of excitement in her chest. Music had always had a way of making her heart race, even in moments of fear or doubt. The pianist sat at the piano and began to play. The first notes filled the room with technical perfection. The crowd was impressed. Every note was clean, precise, executed exactly as it should be. But as the music continued, something about it felt cold. It was flawless, yes, but it didn't move anyone's heart. Some people clapped politely, but others shifted in their seats, waiting for a spark, a warmth, a feeling they could hold on to. The pianist played as if he wanted to show off, as if he was saying, "Look, I am perfect. No one can match me." And then, after a few minutes, he stopped and smiled smugly, soaking in the applause. That's when he noticed her. The simple woman at the back, standing quietly, not clapping immediately like everyone else. His sharp eyes narrowed slightly. He could sense that she was different. Maybe it was the calm in her eyes, the way she wasn't intimidated, or maybe it was something deeper. He had seen many people in his life, people who came to see him perform, people who wanted attention, people who wanted praise. But she seemed like none of them. There was a quiet confidence in her, a kind of presence that demanded attention without asking for it. He called out to her in a loud, condescending voice, "You there! Have you ever played the piano?" The words echoed across the hall, and the crowd turned to look. Some whispered among themselves, wondering if she would answer. She didn't look startled or embarrassed. She only smiled softly. "Yes," she replied simply, her voice calm and steady, carrying just enough volume for everyone to hear. The pianist laughed, a sharp, cutting laugh that made some people wince. "Oh, really?" he said, leaning back slightly, as if to mock her. "Do you think you can play as well as I do? Perhaps you'd like to challenge me? A friendly duel, just for fun?" The audience gasped softly. Some were excited, curious to see what would happen. Others looked concerned, sensing that this was about to turn into a humiliating moment. The woman took a deep breath. She could feel the eyes of the entire hall on her, but she didn't flinch. She walked toward the piano with steady steps, feeling the polished wood beneath her fingers as she sat down. The pianist smirked, certain that this would be over quickly. He thought she would fumble, perhaps hit a wrong note, or show herself to be inexperienced. He imagined the applause that would follow not for her, but for himself, for proving how superior he was. But the woman had other thoughts. She remembered her grandmother, who had taught her the first simple melodies on a tiny old piano at home. She remembered the afternoons spent practicing in secret, the quiet moments when she had lost herself in music and felt free. She remembered the nights of working hard, dreaming that one day she could show the world what music really was, not just notes on a page, but emotions, stories, feelings that could be felt without words. This was not about proving anything to the pianist. It was about letting the music speak. The pianist struck the first key in his mind to start the duel, but she placed her hands lightly on the keys, feeling the familiar weight, the smoothness, and the promise of sound. She closed her eyes for a brief moment, letting the silence of the hall fill her mind. The audience noticed her stillness. Even the pianist, who was used to commanding attention, felt a tiny flicker of unease. There was something about her calmness, something about the way she held herself, that was not afraid. Then she began, not with a flourish or a showy display, not with fast, complicated scales meant to impress. She played a single, simple melody, but it was beautiful. Every note was clear, every pause meaningful. The sound seemed to fill the room in a way that was gentle yet powerful. The pianist frowned, unsure what to make of it. The music wasn't flashy, but it was alive. There was warmth, there was life in it, something he hadn't felt in any of his performances that evening. The audience was silent. No one moved. It was as if the room had become a bubble where only her music existed. People forgot to breathe for a moment. They had come expecting to see a show, expecting to witness a competition, but instead they were listening to a story. And that story was being told by someone who no one expected, a simple woman, quiet, unassuming, yet capable of holding everyone's attention without a single dramatic gesture. The pianist tried to continue, to play louder, to show that his experience and training could overwhelm her simplicity. But it didn't matter. His technical skill seemed mechanical compared to the emotion in her music. It was like watching a machine versus a human soul. The more he played, the more he realized that she was not intimidated, not by his fame, not by his arrogance, not by the expectations of the audience. She was simply being herself, letting the music flow as it wanted to. People leaned forward in their seats. Some whispered to each other, trying to process what they were hearing. Some closed their eyes, letting the melody wash over them. A few even had tears in their eyes, though they didn't admit it aloud. Music had a way of doing that. Sometimes it could bypass words, bypass reason, and reach straight into the heart. And this woman, who had seemed so ordinary, had that power. The pianist finally stopped. His hands hovered above the keys, frozen for a brief moment. He looked at her, expecting perhaps to see doubt, to see nerves, to see some sign that she was not a professional. But there was none. She looked back at him, not with arrogance, not with pride, but with calm confidence. She had said nothing, done nothing to taunt him. She had only played from her heart, and it had spoken louder than any words ever could. For the first time that evening, the audience erupted into applause. But this was different from the polite clapping that had greeted the pianist's performance. This was genuine, spontaneous, heartfelt. People were standing, some cheering, some crying softly. The woman rose from the piano with a humble smile, bowing just slightly, acknowledging the reaction, but not letting it change her composure. The pianist's face had turned red. He felt a mix of disbelief, shame, and awe. For all his training, all his reputation, all the applause he had earned in the past, nothing could compare to what had just happened. He had challenged someone he thought was ordinary, only to realize that talent, passion, and heart were not things that could be measured by fame, suit, or years of formal training. Even the audience noticed the change in him. The arrogance that had filled the room moments ago was gone. Now there was hesitation, a flicker of respect, and perhaps a tiny seed of humility. He had underestimated her, just like he had underestimated the power of music to reveal something deeper than skill alone doubt as the crowd continued to cheer. She stepped back slightly, allowing the pianist to have the stage if he wished. He hesitated. No one had ever made him feel this way. No one had ever challenged him without words, without confrontation, simply by being better at what truly mattered. He realized that this evening would stay with him forever, not for the applause he had received, but for the lesson he had learned in humility. The woman walked back to her seat quietly, not seeking attention, not seeking praise. She had played her music, shared her heart, and reminded everyone present that greatness can go. After the woman's unexpected performance, the room seemed to hold its breath. The applause was still echoing, but the energy had changed. The familiar buzz of excitement was replaced by a quiet tension. Everyone could feel that something important had just happened. People whispered among themselves, eyes shifting between the woman who had captivated them and the famous pianist who now sat frozen in disbelief. Some were still trying to comprehend what they had heard. Others were already starting to talk about her quietly, impressed by the raw talent they had witnessed. The pianist, who had been confident and commanding just moments before, now looked uneasy. He adjusted his posture in the chair, tapping his fingers nervously against the piano bench. He had expected a polite performance at best, a clumsy attempt that he could mock and laugh at afterward. But what he had heard was something completely different. It wasn't just skill. It was emotion. It was life poured into music. He had never faced someone who could command attention without a single flashy move or complicated technique. The simplicity of her performance was what made it extraordinary. He straightened his suit jacket and cleared his throat, trying to regain the control he had lost. "Well, that was unexpected," he said, his voice tight, betraying the tension he tried to hide. He glanced around the room as if seeking support, but he found only curious eyes and cautious smiles. Some people were leaning forward, waiting to see what he would do next. A few looked concerned, realizing that the evening was no longer just about watching a famous pianist perform. It had become a moment that could change the way they thought about talent and humility. The woman sat quietly in her seat, her hands folded in her lap. She didn't smile arrogantly. She didn't seek attention. She only looked calm and composed, as if nothing had happened at all. And yet, the audience could feel the power of her presence. She had already said more with her music than words ever could. There was a quiet dignity about her, a sense that she was grounded in something deeper than fame, applause, or competition. She seemed to understand that the music was what mattered, not the audience's reaction or the pianist's ego. The pianist leaned closer to the microphone, pretending to clear his throat casually, but his eyes kept darting toward her. He felt a mixture of frustration and curiosity. How could someone like her, someone so ordinary in appearance, someone who didn't look like she belonged on a stage-produced music that moved people so deeply? He had trained for years, studied with the best teachers, performed in the most prestigious halls, and yet her performance had shaken him in a way he wasn't prepared for. Determined to reassert his dominance, he spoke loudly to the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen, sometimes talent hides in the most unexpected places," he said, emphasizing the word, sometimes with a smirk. But let's see if this amateur can follow up that first performance. A real duel requires more than a single melody. The audience shifted uncomfortably. Some were excited, eager to see if she would accept his challenge, while others worried that this was turning into a public spectacle that could humiliate her. The woman stood slowly, not in a rush, and walked back to the piano. Her movements were deliberate but gentle, like someone who knew exactly what they were doing. The pianist smirked, thinking that this was her moment of weakness. He expected hesitation, a fumble, or even a refusal. But when she sat down, her posture was calm and confident. She didn't make eye contact with him. She only looked at the piano, as if it were an old friend she hadn't seen in years. The audience fell silent. The hall, which had been buzzing moments ago, now felt like it was holding its breath. Every person in the room seemed to be waiting for something extraordinary to happen. Even those who had never paid much attention to music were captivated. There was a sense that this performance was not just about talent, it was about courage, about stepping forward despite fear, about being true to oneself in front of judgment. The pianist started to play again, determined to show that his experience and training would outshine any raw talent. He performed a complex piece, filled with rapid scales, dramatic chords, and intricate patterns. It was technically impressive. His fingers moved with precision, and the notes filled the room with energy. The audience clapped politely, but it wasn't the same reaction they had given the woman. There was skill, yes, but no soul. There was control, yes, but no story. The pianist's music seemed like a demonstration of technique rather than a conversation with the heart. Then it was her turn again. She didn't rush. She didn't try to compete with the complexity or speed of his playing. Instead, she placed her fingers lightly on the keys and began a simple, flowing melody. But this time, it wasn't just beauty. It was storytelling. The notes spoke of everyday life, the struggles and joys, the quiet victories, the fleeting moments of happiness, and the hidden sorrows. The music was honest and unpretentious. It was not about impressing anyone. It was about connecting with everyone. The audience was captivated. Some people had tears in their eyes. Others leaned forward, as if trying to catch every note, every emotion, every subtle shift in the melody. The pianist's own hands froze over the keys. He could feel the room slipping away from him, the focus moving entirely to her. Every chord, every pause, every gentle rise and fall of the notes seemed to hold meaning far beyond the surface. It was not a performance designed to show off. It was a performance designed to touch heart's dot as she continued. The audience began to notice small details that made the performance even more remarkable. The way her fingers lingered on certain keys, the subtle variations in tempo, the slight pauses that gave weight to the emotion, these were not mistakes. These were choices deliberate and full of meaning. Each note was placed carefully, not just to sound good, but to create a feeling, a connection, a story that everyone in the room could feel. The pianist's face was a mix of shock and disbelief. He had never experienced anything like this before. He was used to control, to being the center of attention, to the applause and admiration of an audience. But now, he was seeing someone strip away all the barriers he had built around music. She wasn't playing to impress. She wasn't playing to win. She was playing to share. And in that moment, the arrogance he had carried so proudly seemed hollow and empty. People in the audience whispered among themselves, "Who is she? Where did she learn to play like that? How can someone so ordinary look so extraordinary while playing?" The questions hung in the air, unanswered, because no one knew her story yet. But everyone could feel the truth in her music. It didn't matter who she was, what she wore, or what her background was. The power of her performance transcended all of that. Even children in the audience, who had been fidgeting in restless moments before, were now completely still. They watched her hands move across the keys, and though they might not have understood all the technicalities, they understood the feeling. They understood that music could be something magical, something that could carry your thoughts and emotions in a way words could never do. The woman had brought that magic into the room, and it didn't matter who had trained her or where she came from. The effect was immediate, undeniable, and unforgettable. The pianist finally stopped. His hands hovered above the keys for a moment, as if afraid to touch them. The room was quiet, except for the soft, spontaneous applause that began to rise from the audience. It started small, tentative, but quickly grew louder as people realized what they had witnessed. There were no cheers of admiration for him, no polite clapping for skill alone. This applause was genuine, heartfelt, and entirely for the woman who had played from her soul. The woman smiled gently and nodded slightly, acknowledging the audience without arrogance. She did not turn to the pianist. She did not need to. The music had already spoken. It had told everyone in the room who she was, and for a moment, no one needed anything else. Even the pianist, who had once believed himself untouchable, could not deny the impact she had made. He sat back in his chair, trying to regain his composure, but he felt a strange mix of emotions, shame, disbelief, and a grudging respect that he could not ignore. He had challenged someone he assumed was weak, inexperienced, and naive, and yet she had turned the challenge into a lesson he would never forget. His pride, his reputation, his years of training, all of it seemed small compared to the raw honesty and emotion she had shared through music. The crowd began to murmur again, this time with admiration and curiosity. People who had been skeptical moments before now whispered eagerly about the woman. Some wanted to know her name. Some wanted to meet her. Some just wanted to understand how someone so unassuming could play with such power and emotion. The pianist, for the first time, felt uncertain. He was used to admiration, to respect, to being seen as untouchable. But now, he was faced with something he could not control, something that did not depend on technique or showmanship, something that belonged to her entirely. The woman stood, not seeking attention, and returned to her seat quietly. She did not demand recognition. She did not flaunt her skill. She had only shared her gift and reminded everyone present that true talent could not be measured by appearance, reputation, or training alone. It was something deeper, something that came from the heart, and it could touch anyone willing to listen. The pianist sat frozen. The silence after her second performance lingered longer than anyone expected. It was not the quiet that comes when a show ends, or when applause dies down. It was the kind of silence that holds a room in suspense, where people cannot even move because they are still wrapped in the echoes of something extraordinary. The air seemed heavier, filled with emotion, with awe, and with a kind of respect that had not been there when the evening began. The pianist, who had once commanded every eye and ear in the hall, was now uncertain. He had rehearsed his gestures, his confident smiles, and even his condescending jokes to charm the audience. But tonight, none of it had worked. The woman's music had struck deeper than technique, faster than training, and with a sincerity he could not match. He found himself looking at her, watching every subtle movement, every small adjustment she made as she sat quietly, as if nothing had happened. She had changed the rules of the evening without speaking a word. Whispers began to circulate around the room. People leaned toward each other, voices hushed yet full of curiosity. "Do you see her hands?" One woman said. "So delicate yet so powerful. How can someone ordinary play like that?" Others nodded silently, sharing the wonder in their eyes. Children who had been restless at the start now sat as still as statues, mesmerized by the presence of someone who made music feel alive and real. Even the pianist noticed the shift. The room had changed. It no longer belonged solely to him. The woman, sensing the tension and curiosity, did something unexpected. She stood up and walked toward the center of the stage, not to perform immediately, but to speak. She was soft-spoken, yet her voice carried through the hall, clear and calm. "Music," she said, "is not about showing off or proving superiority. Music is about connection. It is about the moments we feel, the memories we carry, and the hearts we touch." Her words were simple, but they had weight. They were like gentle chords, reminding the audience that what mattered was not competition, but expression. Some in the crowd nodded. Others whispered to themselves, realizing the truth in what she said. Even the pianist shifted in his seat, uncomfortable with the idea that he had been approaching music all wrong. He had thought it was about perfection, about speed, about technique, about applause. But here was someone who had no need for recognition, no desire for fame, who could command the attention of the room without force or arrogance. She had not come to prove herself. She had only come to play. The pianist cleared his throat, attempting to regain control, but the words felt hollow even to him. Perhaps we should have a true duel," he said, trying to sound casual, confident, and commanding all at once. "Let us see who can truly impress this audience." But even as he spoke, he noticed a subtle shift in the people around him. There were no nervous giggles. There were no anxious glances toward him. The audience had already been captivated by her presence and her performance. And though they waited politely for the next notes to fall, it was clear where their hearts had gone. The woman returned to the piano. She did not hesitate. She did not glance at him with anger or rivalry. She simply sat, adjusting the bench slightly, her fingers brushing the keys lightly, feeling the familiar weight and texture. The pianist watched her, expecting hesitation, expecting a mistake, expecting uncertainty. But she was steady. Her calmness was not fearlessness in defiance. It was certainty in her own ability, confidence born from quiet dedication and deep understanding that the audience could feel the tension. It was not just a duel of skill anymore. It was a duel of presence, of heart, of understanding what music truly meant. People leaned forward, some holding their breath, others closing their eyes, sensing that what was about to happen would not just be another performance. It would be a revelation. The pianist began again, launching into a technically complex piece. It was fast, precise, and powerful. The notes flew across the hall like sparks from a fire. He moved with the confidence of someone who had won countless competitions, played in grand theaters, and been praised by critics worldwide. Yet, as he played, there was a subtle emptiness, a gap between the notes that seemed to lack the depth of feeling the audience had already felt from her. The applause that followed was polite, but there was a difference. People clapped because they knew it was skillful, not because they had felt it in their hearts. Then it was her turn. She leaned slightly forward, resting her hands lightly on the keys, closing her eyes briefly. When she began to play, it was not loud or dramatic. It was a melody that seemed to come from memory, from life, from experiences too vast to name. It was slow at first, like the beginning of a story, simple but rich. Her fingers moved with intention, every note a word, every chord a sentence. The hall seemed to disappear around her. There were no walls, no lights, no faces, only the sound, only the story her hands were telling. The audience was entranced. Even those who had never truly listened to music before could feel its depth. There was sorrow and joy, struggle and hope, all woven into a melody that seemed to speak directly to each listener. Children leaned closer, sensing the emotion, even if they did not fully understand it. Adults closed their eyes, letting memories and feelings rise as the music carried them gently through the hall. People who had been talking quietly before now sat completely still, unable to resist the pull of the melody. The pianist stopped mid-piece, unable to continue. He felt as if someone had removed the foundation of his confidence. He had come to show his superiority, to entertain and command, but she had shifted the focus entirely. He could feel the weight of her music pressing into his own sense of skill and achievement. For the first time, he was seeing not just the technical side of music, but the emotional side, the side that could not be taught in schools, could not be learned from critics, could not be perfected through practice alone. It came from life, from experience, from heart. People began whispering again, but now with a sense of awe rather than curiosity. How can someone like her play like that? One woman whispered, "She doesn't look like she has ever been on a stage like this, yet she owns it." Another voice added, "It's like she's telling a story we all know, but never could put into words." The audience was not simply impressed. They were moved. They were feeling something that went beyond music, beyond applause, beyond the skill of the notes. The woman's performance continued to build subtly, not with loud flourishes or dramatic effects, but with layers of emotion. She moved between light, airy passages and deep, resonant chords, creating contrasts that reflected the complexity of life itself. Each note felt deliberate, thoughtful, and filled with intention. The hall seemed to breathe with her. Each person was caught in the rhythm of her story, the rise and fall of her melodies, mirroring the highs and lows of their own hearts. The pianist watched, feeling a mixture of awe and discomfort. He had played the piano his entire life, spent years in conservatories, studied with masters. And yet here was someone who had never been celebrated or crowned with accolades, showing him a level of artistry that left him speechless. He realized that he had never truly understood music until now. He had been focused on perfection, on recognition, on control, while she had been focused on expression, on connection, on truth. The audience could sense the tension between the two performers, even without words. It was not a competition of arrogance or ego. It was a silent acknowledgement of something greater than themselves. People leaned forward, sensing the rare moment when true talent meets true heart, and the result is beyond explanation. The music spoke louder than any introduction, louder than any applause, louder than the ego that had tried to dominate the room moments before. When she finished, the hall was silent for just a moment, as if everyone needed to catch their breath. Then the applause began, slow at first, hesitant, and then rising like a wave, overwhelming in its intensity. People stood, cheered, clapped, some even wiped tears from their eyes. The applause was for her, yes, but it was also for the reminder that beauty, talent, and truth can come from anywhere, that extraordinary things often hide in the most ordinary people. The pianist sat in silence, absorbing the moment. He realized that the duel he had imagined as a contest of superiority had turned into a lesson in humility. He had been shown something he could never have learned from a teacher or a competition. He had been shown that music was more than skill. It was soul, heart, and honesty. And he had been shown that no amount of fame, training, or arrogance could match the power of a person who played from life, not for applause. The woman returned to her seat with quiet dignity. She did not seek attention. She did not bask in praise. She simply smiled softly, acknowledging the audience's admiration without needing to claim it. She had played because she loved the music, because it was part of her being, because she had something to say that could only be expressed through the piano. And in doing so, she had reminded everyone in the room, including the famous pianist, of what truly matters in life and in art. The pianist finally spoke, his voice quieter, softer, and less confident than before. I have never heard anything like that," he said. There was no smirk, no arrogance, no attempt to command attention. There was only honesty in his words, a recognition of her skill, her heart, and her courage. For the first time, he was no longer the Sente. The hall had become a place of anticipation, almost vibrating with the collective curiosity of everyone present. People had witnessed something remarkable already, and yet there was a sense that the evening had not reached its peak. The woman's calm demeanor, her quiet confidence, and the heartfelt music she had already played had captured the hearts of everyone in the room. Still, the famous pianist remained on the stage, tense and uncertain, unable to reconcile his pride with the undeniable impact of her performance. The woman walked back to the piano again, but this time there was a change in her energy. It was subtle but noticeable. She moved with an elegance that came not from training or desire for attention, but from being completely at ease in her own skin. The audience watched in quiet fascination as she adjusted the bench, the leather creaking softly under her weight, and then rested her hands lightly on the keys. She did not look at the pianist, though he watched her intently, his fingers still poised over the piano, as if ready to respond. Instead, she closed her eyes, letting the silence of the hall surround her. A few people in the audience exchanged glances. They could sense that something extraordinary was about to happen. The woman took a slow, deep breath, as if drawing in all the energy from the room. Then, with the lightest touch, she pressed a single key. The note hung in the air, like a droplet of water suspended in midair, delicate yet full of presence. It was not loud, not dramatic, but it carried a resonance that immediately captured everyone's attention. People leaned in instinctively, as if drawn closer by the sound alone. She began to play a melody that was unlike anything the audience had heard before. It started simple, almost like a whisper, but gradually built into something richer, more layered, and profoundly moving. The notes flowed with a natural grace, weaving together sorrow and joy, tension and relief, hope and longing. Every movement of her hands, every subtle shift in tempo, every pause seemed intentional, as if each gesture had been carefully chosen to tell a story that words could not express. The pianist watched, stunned. He had played countless pieces, mastered every technique, and performed in halls far larger than this one. Yet nothing he had ever done could compare to the feeling that filled the room as she played. Her music was alive. It was not about impressing anyone or showing skill. It was about connecting with every person present, touching hearts in ways that no technical mastery alone could achieve. For the first time, he realized that music was not just a series of notes. It was a living, breathing language, and she spoke it fluently. The audience was silent, but it was a silence filled with awe and wonder. Some people closed their eyes, letting the melody wash over them, while others sat forward, trying to absorb every subtle detail. The woman's performance seemed to unfold like a story, each passage revealing another layer of emotion. It was as if she were speaking directly to each listener, offering them a glimpse into her own experiences and inviting them to feel. Alongside her, there was a moment when the music shifted. It became more dynamic, moving from gentle, flowing passages to bold, resonant chords that filled the hall with energy. The audience felt it in their chests, in the subtle vibrations that seemed to ripple through the floor and the walls. The pianist felt it too, and a sense of awe mingled with disbelief settled over him. He had been trained to play with precision, to master every note, but he had never been trained to play like this, with heart, with soul, with a presence that made every listener feel something personal and profound. The woman's hands moved across the keys with effortless grace, her fingers seemingly dancing while carrying immense weight and emotion. She did not rush. She did not seek to dazzle with speed or complexity. Every note was measured, deliberate, and full of intention. It was a performance that demanded attention, not through showiness, but through truth. Each chord seemed to tell stories of love, of struggle, of quiet victories and deep losses. The audience could feel it. Every person was engaged, feeling the music in a way that went beyond listening. It became a shared experience. Intimate and profound, the pianist tried to play along, his hands moving over the keys, attempting to respond, to assert his dominance. But no matter how technically perfect his notes were, they felt hollow next to hers. It was not about speed or volume or complexity anymore. It was about presence, about emotion, about a connection that could not be manufactured. The woman's music had a life of its own, and it seemed to absorb everything around it, leaving no room for artificiality or arrogance. The audience began to respond instinctively. Some people wiped tears from their eyes. Others leaned closer to catch every subtle nuance. Even those who had come out of curiosity rather than appreciation for music were now fully engaged, unable to look away. Children who had been restless moments before were now completely still, sensing the power of the melody, even if they could not fully understand it. Every person present felt something unique, something personal. In the notes she played, the pianist sat back for a moment, his hands frozen above the keys. He realized, perhaps for the first time in his life, that technical skill alone was not enough. He had been trained to play perfectly, to impress, to dominate, but he had never been taught how to make music live in the hearts of listeners. And now he was watching someone who did exactly that, without any pretense, without any desire for recognition, simply because it was what she loved to do. The woman continued, the melody flowing seamlessly from one emotion to another. There was a rise in tempo, a gentle crescendo that felt like hope, followed by a sudden, quiet diminuendo that reflected introspection and reflection. The audience was completely absorbed. Every movement of her hands, every subtle shift in dynamics, told a story that went beyond the notes themselves. It was not a performance for praise or admiration. It was a performance for life itself, for the feelings that bind people together and the experiences that shape them. The pianist could not help but watch in amazement. He realized that he had underestimated her completely. He had assumed that someone who appeared simple, who had not been part of the elite world of music, could not possibly compete with him. But here she was, proving not only that he was wrong, but that his understanding of music had been shallow compared to the depth she could convey with a single melody. For the first time, he felt humility, and it was a strange, unfamiliar sensation. The hall seemed to pulse with the rhythm of her music. It was not a rhythm in the mechanical sense, but a rhythm of life, of breath, of emotion. Each note seemed to reach into the audience, touching them in ways that went beyond conscious thought. People who had come to see a duel, to witness a performance, were now experiencing something far more profound, a connection, a shared human experience, created entirely by the woman's music. Time seemed to slow as she continued. The melody became richer, more intricate, yet never overwhelming. It was as if she were balancing complexity and simplicity perfectly, creating a musical conversation that invited the audience to participate silently, to feel, to remember, to hope. Every chord she played resonated with emotion. Every pause was deliberate. Every soft passage was full of unspoken meaning. It was artistry in its purest form, a reminder that music was not just notes on a page, but a reflection of the human soul. The pianist tried to follow, to match her depth, but he found that no matter how perfectly he executed each note, it lacked the life and sincerity that flowed from her fingers. He realized that this was not a duel he could win. He could not compete with someone who played not for victory, not for recognition, but simply because music was part of who they were. Every attempt he made only emphasized the difference between skill and soul, between training and lived experience, between performance and connection. The audience's reaction was immediate and undeniable. People leaned forward, their eyes wide, their breaths caught in their chests. Some whispered softly to one another, unable to articulate the feelings the music had stirred. Others closed their eyes, letting themselves be carried by the melody, letting it guide them through memories and emotions they had long buried. Children sat quietly, completely absorbed, sensing the magic of the moment even without understanding the technical mastery behind it. The woman's performance reached its peak, a moment of profound beauty and emotion. The hall seemed to vibrate with the energy she had created, a shared experience that bound everyone present together in a way words could never capture. It was as if the music had created a space outside of time, a space where only feeling and connection mattered. Every note resonated with truth. Every pause held meaning. Every subtle variation reflected her understanding of life and of human emotion. Finally, she brought the melody to a gentle close. The last note lingered in the air, a soft echo that seemed to hang between the audience and the performer. For a moment, there was complete silence, a collective breath held in awe. Then slowly, the applause began. At first tentative, then growing louder, until it filled the hall with a roar of appreciation. People rose to their feet, clapping, cheering, some with tears in their eyes. They were not clapping for technique alone. They were clapping for the story, for the heart, for the life that had poured from her hands and into their own hearts. The pianist sat frozen, staring at her with a mixture of D. The applause was still echoing through the hall, but now it was mixed with something deeper, a kind of awe that went beyond appreciation of skill. People were not simply impressed. They were moved. The woman had shown them a side of music that was alive, breathing, and deeply personal. Her performance had touched hearts in a way that left the audience silent for a brief moment, trying to process what they had just experienced. The atmosphere in the room was almost electric, charged with emotion and the memory of her extraordinary playing. The pianist remained seated, his hands still hovering over the keys, as if he were unsure what to do next. He had been trained to command the stage, to assert his skill, and to receive recognition without question. Yet after her performance, he felt a strange mix of humility and confusion. He had expected a duel of technical skill, a contest of speed and precision. But what had occurred was something entirely different, a quiet, profound lesson in artistry, emotion, and presence. His ego, which had been so dominant at the start of the evening, felt fragile, almost insignificant. People in the audience were whispering among themselves. Some shook their heads in disbelief, while others leaned forward, unable to contain their excitement. "Did you see that?" One woman murmured to her friend. "I have never heard anything so pure. Her music, it spoke to me." Another voice added, "She didn't just play. She told a story, and it felt like she was telling it to each of us individually." The whispers grew, spreading like wildfire as people shared their astonishment and admiration. The woman returned to her seat quietly, her posture calm and composed. She did not need to revel in applause or attention. She had already achieved what mattered most. She had shared her music honestly, with heart and sincerity. And yet, the audience could feel her presence in a way that commanded respect without demanding it. She was not there to compete, not there to prove herself. She was there simply to play, and the impact of that choice was profound. The pianist finally cleared his throat, his voice low and measured, but still carrying a trace of uncertainty. I must admit," he began, "that I did not expect this. I have performed for audiences around the world, yet what I have witnessed here tonight is unlike anything I have ever experienced. Your music, it is not just skill. It is life. It carries a depth that I have never truly understood until this moment." His words were hesitant, almost uncomfortable for him, because they came from a place of humility that he was not accustomed to expressing. The woman looked at him, her expression calm and gentle. She did not smile smugly, nor did she seek to make him feel small. Instead, she nodded slightly, as if acknowledging his honesty and his courage to admit the truth. "Thank you," she said softly. Music is not about winning or losing, not about impressing others. It is about sharing, about feeling, and about connecting. That is all that matters. Her words were simple, but they carried the weight of experience, understanding, and sincerity. The audience watched this interaction quietly, sensing the shift in the dynamic between the two performers. The pianist, who had begun the evening with arrogance and confidence, was now visibly changed. His eyes were wide, his posture less rigid, his expression more thoughtful. He had been confronted, not by a rival seeking to challenge him in arrogance, but by someone whose talent and heart surpassed technical skill alone. And in that moment, he felt a growing respect for her, a recognition of something far deeper than notes and scales. People in the hall began to clap again, this time not for a performance, but for the exchange itself. There was admiration for the woman's talent, yes, but also for her grace and humility. There was respect for the pianist as well, for his willingness to acknowledge the truth and to confront his own limitations. It was a moment of shared humanity, where competition and ego fell away, leaving only the beauty of music and the honesty of emotion. After a pause, the pianist stood slowly. He approached her, not with arrogance, not with condescension, but with a quiet humility that surprised even him. "I must ask," he said, his voice steady now, "where did you learn to play like that? Your technique is flawless, but it is more than that. Your music has feeling, depth. It speaks in ways I have never encountered before." The woman smiled softly, her eyes reflecting warmth and calm. "I studied music for many years, long ago," she explained, "but I left the professional world. I wanted to live a simpler life, to play for joy and for connection, not for recognition or fame. Music has always been part of me, even when I wasn't performing on stages like this. And tonight, I simply played what I felt, what came from life itself." Her words were measured, humble, yet they carried a profound truth. She did not need to boast or justify herself. The honesty in her voice and the power of her music spoke louder than any claim she could make. The pianist nodded slowly, absorbing her words. He realized more fully than ever how narrow his own understanding of music had been. He had pursued perfection, accolades, and recognition, but he had neglected the heart of what music truly was. She had reminded him that music was not about showing off, not about being the best, not about impressing others. It was about connection, about expression, and about honesty. And for the first time in his career, he felt that he had learned something invaluable, not from a teacher, not from a competition, but from someone who played with truth and soul, the audience. Sensing this moment of understanding, began to respond again. The applause was warm, genuine, and filled with appreciation, not just for the performance, but for the lesson it represented. People were inspired, moved, and thoughtful. They had witnessed a rare exchange, where talent and humility met, where ego and sincerity confronted each other, and where music became a bridge between hearts. It was not just a performance. It was a revelation. The woman returned to her seat quietly, her hands resting in her lap. She did not need to say more. She had shared her music, her story, and her perspective, and that was enough. The audience could feel her impact, could sense the depth of her talent and character, and could recognize the quiet courage it took to perform without expectation, without the need to prove herself. Her simplicity was not weakness. It was strength, and it resonated deeply with everyone present. The pianist remained standing, looking at her with a mixture of admiration and contemplation. He realized that he had underestimated her entirely. He had assumed that her simplicity meant a lack of skill or experience. Yet she had demonstrated something far beyond technique. She had shown mastery of emotion, of storytelling, of presence. And he understood that he had been wrong to judge, wrong to assume, wrong to think that the world of music belonged only to those who sought fame and accolades. As the applause continued, the woman's eyes scanned the audience. She saw the faces of people moved, inspired, and changed by the music. She saw children wide-eyed with wonder, adults quietly reflecting on memories, and even the pianist himself, who now looked at her not as a rival, but as a teacher in a way, someone who had reminded him of the true meaning of music. She felt a quiet satisfaction, not from recognition, but from the knowledge that she had shared something real, something meaningful, something lasting. The pianist finally spoke again, his voice softer, filled with genuine respect. I have learned more from you tonight than from any teacher or stage I have ever known, he admitted. His eyes met hers, and for the first time there was no arrogance, no judgment, only acknowledgement. You have reminded me that music is not about technique alone. It is about honesty, feeling, and connection. And for that, I thank you. The woman nodded, a gentle smile on her face. And I thank you, she replied, for showing me that even someone so trained and accomplished can still learn, can still be reminded of what truly matters. Music is a gift, not a tool for ego. When we share it with heart, it changes everyone, including ourselves. The audience erupted into applause again, not for skill, not for fame, but for the lesson, for the authenticity, for the shared human experience. People were moved, some silently, some openly, but all had been touched by the moment. It was a rare thing, a true connection, where art and life intertwined in a way that could not be forgotten. The pianist returned to his seat, no longer commanding the room, but listening, reflecting, and absorbing. He realized that he had been humbled, not defeated, and that humility was not weakness, but understanding. He had witnessed something extraordinary, and it would stay with him forever, reshaping his perspective, his approach, and his respect for what music could truly be. The woman remained calm, serene, and quietly proud. She had played her heart, touched countless lives, and reminded everyone that greatness could come from anywhere. She had shown that the measure of talent was not in recognition, not in applause, and not in technical perfection, but in the honesty, courage, and connection that music can create. And in that moment, she had become more than a performer. She had become an inspiration. The audience continued to cheer, rising to their feet, some crying quietly, some beaming with joy. They had witnessed more than a performance. They had witnessed a lesson in life, art, and humanity. The pianist looked on, finally understanding that this was the true victory, not over a rival, not over an audience, but over the limitations of ego and misunderstanding. And the woman, humble and gracious, had given it to him. The hall had finally quieted down. The applause that had once filled every corner now settled into murmurs and sighs, the kind that come after something deeply moving. People shifted in their seats, some still lost in thought, others leaning close to companions, trying to find words for what they had just experienced. But words felt inadequate. No conversation could fully capture the weight of the evening, the emotions that had been stirred, or the quiet transformation of everyone who had been present. The woman remained seated, hands folded gently in her lap. She did not look around, did not seek praise, did not gesture toward the applause. Her presence alone held the room in quiet attention. There was no need for fanfare. The impact of her music and her honesty was enough. Every person in the hall, from the youngest child to the most seasoned music critic, could feel it. It was in the way their hearts had shifted, in the way a new respect for simplicity, truth, and authenticity had entered their thoughts. The pianist, once brimming with confidence, now sat quietly, his eyes fixed on her. The usual pride and arrogance that had defined him seemed distant, almost foreign. For hours, he had lived under the assumption that skill, fame, and recognition defined greatness. But she had taught him otherwise. Her music, unassuming yet profound, had reshaped his understanding of what it meant to be an artist. It was not about applause, not about precision, not about proving oneself. It was about connecting, touching lives, and expressing truth in its purest form. The audience began to settle. The initial excitement replaced with a reflective stillness. People spoke softly among themselves, marveling at the performance they had witnessed. "I can't believe it," one woman whispered. "I thought I understood music, but she showed me there's so much more to it. It's like she played not just with her hands, but with her soul." A man nodded, adding, "It's not about speed or complexity or skill. It's about feeling. It's about truth. I've never heard anything like it in my life." The pianist finally rose from his seat, walking slowly toward her. There was no dramatic gesture, no attempt to reclaim attention, no arrogance. His steps were deliberate, weighed down with the awareness of what he had learned. He stopped beside her, a respectful distance away, and simply watched her for a moment. It was the longest moment he had ever experienced on a stage, a pause filled with reflection and acknowledgement. "Your music," he said quietly, almost hesitantly. "It is unlike anything I have ever experienced. I have spent my life training, performing, and mastering technique. Yet tonight, I have learned that none of it compares to what you have shown. It is not the notes alone, not the speed or precision. It is the heart, the life behind the music. You have reminded me what it truly means to play." His voice was steady but gentle, carrying the weight of humility and genuine respect. The woman looked at him, her eyes calm, and offered a soft smile. "Music is not a contest," she replied. "It is not about proving who is better, or faster, or more skilled. It is about sharing, about connection, and about the courage to express what is true. You have talent, you have skill, but it is easy to forget that music is alive only when it speaks to the heart. Tonight, we shared that moment, and that is what matters." The pianist nodded slowly, absorbing her words. He had spent decades perfecting his craft, winning competitions, and performing on prestigious stages. And yet, here was someone who had taken the same instrument and, without trying to impress, had created a resonance he could never have anticipated. Her simplicity, her calm presence, and her honest approach had reminded him of the essence of artistry that he had long overlooked. The audience watched silently, sensing the exchange between the two musicians. It was no longer a duel, no longer a competition. It was a moment of recognition, a mutual acknowledgement of respect, humility, and understanding. The energy in the room was subtle yet profound, a shared realization that greatness is not defined by accolades, but by authenticity, courage, and the ability to touch lives. The woman stood quietly, walking to the center of the stage. She looked at the audience, her gaze sweeping over every face, acknowledging their presence without seeking approval. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice carrying clearly across the hall, "for listening, for feeling, for allowing music to speak in its own way. Every note, every melody, every pause has meaning only because it is heard, only because it is felt. Music belongs to all of us when we share it with honesty and heart." Her words were simple, yet they resonated deeply. People nodded, some with tears in their eyes, others with smiles of quiet understanding. Children leaned toward their parents, sensing the significance of what had been said. Adults whispered softly, reflecting on the truth they had heard and the lesson they had witnessed. Even the pianist remained still, absorbing the meaning behind her voice, the humility in her demeanor, and the strength in her simplicity. The woman returned to the piano one final time. She did not rush, did not try to impress, did not seek to outshine. She simply sat, rested her fingers lightly on the keys, and allowed the music to flow naturally. This time, it was not a performance in the traditional sense. It was a gentle, reflective melody, a soft conversation with the audience. The notes moved slowly, deliberately, carrying calm, warmth, and an almost invisible strength. The hall was completely silent. Every listener leaned in, drawn to the subtle beauty of the music. The melody was not grand or complex, yet it felt complete. It spoke of life's quiet moments, of resilience, of hope, and of the beauty that exists in everyday experiences. People could feel it deep within themselves, a reflection of their own joys, sorrows, struggles, and triumphs. It was music as life, and life as music. The pianist, watching her, felt a shift within himself. He had always believed that mastery was about control, about perfection, about asserting oneself over the instrument and the audience. But now he understood that true mastery was about surrender. It was about listening, feeling, and allowing music to flow through you. The technical skills were important, yes, but they were meaningless without the heart that animated them. She had demonstrated that with grace, simplicity, and quiet confidence, the audience's reaction was almost imperceptible at first. There were no dramatic cheers, no shouting, no overwhelming applause. Instead, there was a shared, quiet sense of appreciation. People leaned back in their seats, exhaling slowly, as if releasing the weight of what they had felt. Some closed their eyes, letting the music settle within them. Others looked at one another, sharing a smile, a nod, a silent acknowledgement that they had experienced something rare and profound. The woman finished the melody, letting the last note linger gently before fading into silence. She remained seated, hands resting lightly on her lap, her eyes closed for a brief moment. When she opened them, she looked at the audience and then at the pianist. There was a calm strength in her gaze, an unspoken understanding that she had done what mattered most. She had played with honesty, with heart, and with courage. That was all she needed. The pianist approached the piano once more. This time, there was no challenge, no attempt to dominate, no expectation. He simply knelt slightly, resting a hand lightly on the edge of the piano, and spoke with quiet reverence. "You have shown me what I have been missing," he said softly. "Not in notes or technique, but in heart. I have spent my life pursuing skill, and tonight I have learned that skill alone is nothing without truth and feeling. Thank you for reminding me of what music truly is." The woman nodded, her eyes reflecting warmth and understanding. "And I thank you," she replied, "for being open enough to see it, to feel it, and to learn from it. Music is never about who is better or faster. It is about honesty, courage, and connection. When we remember that, every note, every melody, every pause becomes meaningful." The audience responded with applause, rising to their feet, some moved to tears, others smiling quietly with gratitude. It was not applause for a duel won or lost, not for fame or recognition, but for a shared experience, for the honesty and beauty that had filled the hall. It was the kind of applause that celebrated life, connection, and the human heart. The pianist stepped back, letting the woman take the stage fully. He realized that the evening had transformed him. He understood that humility was not weakness, that talent was not measured by recognition, and that true art came from honesty and presence. He had come to perform, to prove himself, to impress others, but instead he had learned. He had been humbled, inspired, and reminded of what mattered most. The woman took a final bow, quiet yet commanding. She had shared her gift, touched countless lives, and reminded everyone present of the simple truth that greatness is not about appearance, fame, or technical skill alone. It is about honesty, heart, courage, and connection. The audience would leave the hall changed, carrying with them a memory, a lesson. and a feeling that would linger long after the last note faded out as the people filed out. The pianist remained seated for a moment, reflecting. He had been challenged, humbled, and enlightened. He realized that this evening had not been about competition. It had been about learning, about understanding, and about the true meaning of music. And he knew that the memory of her performance, her presence, and her humility would stay with him for the rest of his life. The woman quietly gathered her belongings, her demeanor calm.